March 4th, 1943, 13:47 hours, 18,000 feet over the Bismarck Sea. Captain Edward Ed Larner watched hydraulic fluid spray across his cockpit windscreen in thin red streams that looked like blood against Pacific sky. His B-25 Mitchell bomber, tail number 41 at 12463, nicknamed Hell's Bells, had taken 37mm cannon hit from Japanese Zero fighter 30 seconds earlier. The shell had severed main hydraulic lines running through the nose section. Without hydraulic pressure, he had no flaps, no landing gear, no brakes, and most critically, no nose wheel steering. Behind him in the fuselage, 5 crew members were still alive. Navigator Lieutenant James Chen, Bombardier Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, Radio Operator Technical Sergeant Robert Walsh, 2 waist gunners, Sergeant Paul Henderson and Sergeant Frank Morrison. All 5 men were depending on Larner to get them home to Port Moresby, Papua New Guinea, 140 miles southeast across open ocean. The mathematics of the situation were absolute. Without hydraulics, landing the B-25 was impossible using conventional procedures. The aircraft would touch down at approximately 110 miles per hour with no way to slow. Without nose wheel steering, the bomber would veer off runway on landing, cartwheel, and explode, killing everyone aboard. The manual said, bailout, standard operating procedure for catastrophic hydraulic failure at altitude over water, was crew abandons aircraft, parachutes into ocean, awaits rescue by Catalina flying boats or PT boats patrolling the area. But Larner had information that changed the calculation. From 18,000 feet, he could see the entire Bismarck Sea engagement unfolding below. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea, 3-day aerial engagement between Allied and Japanese forces, was reaching its climax. American and Australian aircraft were attacking Japanese convoy attempting to reinforce Lae, New Guinea. The ocean surface below was covered with Japanese ships and lifeboats and swimmers from vessels already sunk. If his crew bailed out over this combat zone, they would descend directly into area where Japanese forces were fighting for survival. Japanese sailors would capture them or kill them. Either outcome was unacceptable. Larner made decision in approximately 10 seconds that would later cause military psychiatrists to question his sanity and superior officers to recommend him for Medal of Honor. He would not bail out. He would not ditch in ocean near Japanese forces. Instead, he would fly 140 miles back to Port Moresby and land the crippled B-25 without hydraulics, using technique that had never been attempted in combat conditions and that engineering manuals said was theoretically possible but practically suicidal. He would turn his dying bomber into controlled bomb. He would approach runway at maximum speed, not the normal 110 mph, but rather 180 mph. He would not attempt to land conventionally. Instead, he would fly the aircraft into the ground at precise angle calculated to skip the bomber along runway surface like stone, skipping across water. He would use friction and impact to slow the aircraft through series of controlled bounces. And he would do this with 5 crew members still aboard, betting their lives on his ability to execute maneuver that he had never practiced and that might kill them all in spectacular fireball visible from miles away. Think about that calculation. March 1943, damaged bomber at 18,000 feet, 5 crew members alive, hydraulic failure making conventional landing impossible. Standard procedure says bail out, but bailout means capture or death because enemy forces control waters below. So instead of following procedure, instead of choosing certain survival for himself by parachuting away from doomed aircraft, Larner chose uncertain survival for everyone by attempting landing that existed only in theory. What Larner didn't know as he banked Hell's Bells toward Port Moresby was that ground crews at the airfield had been watching the battle through binoculars and had already counted his aircraft among the presumed lost. That tower personnel had cleared all other aircraft from traffic pattern, expecting to see his B-25 either ditch in ocean or explode in mid-air. That fire crews had positioned equipment at runway's end, preparing for crash they believed would kill everyone aboard. What Larner didn't know was that technique he was about to attempt, intentional ground collision at high speed to create series of bounces that would dissipate kinetic energy, would later be studied by NASA engineers researching emergency landing procedures for aircraft with catastrophic system failures. That his execution would be documented in engineering papers analyzing how friction, angle of attack, and aircraft structural integrity interact during unconventional landings. That's 60 years later, when US Airways Flight 1549 would ditch in Hudson River, investigators would reference Larner's 1943 landing as historical precedent for creative problem-solving under catastrophic failure conditions. What Larner didn't know was that his decision would spark debate lasting decades about the line between heroism and recklessness. That military psychiatrists would later question whether his choice represented sound judgment under pressure or dangerous disregard for established safety procedures. That his squadron commander would simultaneously recommend him for Medal of Honor while also ordering psychiatric evaluation to determine if he was fit to continue flying combat missions. That the phrase calculated insanity would enter Air Force terminology describing decisions that appear irrational but prove effective through unconventional application of physics and flying skill. What Larner didn't know was that his crew members, the 5 men whose lives depended entirely on his ability to execute impossible landing, would spend rest of their lives defending his decision against critics who said he should have followed procedure and bailed out. That navigator Chen would testify at evaluation board. Larner didn't risk our lives, he saved them. Bailout over enemy-controlled waters meant capture or death. The landing attempt gave us chance when procedure gave us none. That this testimony from men who had most to lose would become central to debate about command authority versus regulatory compliance. What Larner didn't know was that within hours of landing, before anyone had time to celebrate survival or question decision-making, he would be reassigned to different squadron and different aircraft to prevent him from flying with same crew again. That Air Force brass feared his willingness to deviate from standard procedures might encourage other pilots to attempt equally dangerous maneuvers without Larner's combination of skill and desperation that had made success possible. That successful unconventional solutions sometimes create institutional problems by suggesting that procedures aren't absolute. What Larner didn't know was that his B-25 Hell's Bells, after being repaired following the landing, would be permanently grounded and used for parts. That Air Force engineers would examine aircraft's structure, discovering that fuselage had compressed by 7 inches during the bouncing landing, compression that had absorbed kinetic energy preventing fireball but also making aircraft structurally unsound for future flight. That this physical evidence would support his claim that the landing technique had worked exactly as calculated. Aircraft had functioned as designed, but had sacrificed its own structural integrity to save crew. What Larner didn't know was that footage of his landing, recorded by ground crew member with 16mm camera who had expected to document spectacular crash, would become training film shown to generations of military pilots studying emergency procedures. That the film would be titled Unconventional Recovery from Catastrophic Hydraulic Failure, with subtitle in smaller text, Not recommended under any circumstances unless all conventional options exhausted. That this contradictory message, showing technique while warning against using it, would capture institutional ambivalence about innovation versus procedure. What Larner didn't know was that he was about to demonstrate principle that would become central to aviation safety philosophy. When all systems designed to keep you alive have failed, aircraft becomes tool rather than vehicle. And pilot must treat landing as controlled demolition rather than conventional touchdown. that his willingness to destroy aircraft to save crew would influence how later generations approached emergency scenarios. That sacrifice the machine to save the men would become unofficial doctrine for situations where procedure offered no survival options. The mathematics of his decision were being written in velocity calculations and angle of attack equations and structural stress limits that would determine whether 5 men lived or died in next 18 minutes. And those mathematics would prove that sometimes sanity means ignoring regulations that assume systems will work and choosing insanity that acknowledges when systems have catastrophically failed. By the time Larner leveled Hell's Bells at 180 miles per hour, approaching Port Moresby runway with 5 crew members strapped into crash positions, bracing for impact that might kill them all, the transformation from conventional pilot to unconventional problem solver was complete, and the calculation that military procedure was suggestion rather than commandment when survival demanded creative physics had been made. 13:42 hours, 5 minutes earlier. 5 minutes before hydraulic failure ended conventional options, Hell's Bells was attacking Japanese destroyer in standard bombing run over Bismarck Sea as part of coordinated strike involving 40 Allied aircraft. Larner's post-mission report, filed March 5, 1943, preserved at Air Force Historical Research Agency, described the attack sequence with detail that would later help investigators understand what had led to hydraulic damage. The report stated that Hell's Bells approached target at 18,000 feet in formation with 3 other B-25s. According to the report, at 13:42 hours we commenced bombing run on Japanese destroyer identified as Arashio class. Aircraft descended to 12,000 feet for improved targeting accuracy. Bombardier Torres acquired target and prepared to release 500-pound bombs. At 13:43 hours, approximately 30 seconds before bomb release, our formation encountered enemy fighter opposition, estimated 6 to 8 Zero fighters attacking from above. The report documented that defensive fire from waist gunners engaged pursuing Zeros. According to the account, Sergeant Henderson firing starboard gun scored hits on 1 Zero, causing visible smoke from engine. Zero broke off attack. Second Zero pressed attack from port side, passing within estimated 200 feet of our aircraft. Sergeant Morrison fired approximately 150 rounds at approaching fighter. Zero's wingman executed deflection shot from 400 yards using 37mm cannon mounted in nose. We observed muzzle flash and tracer indicating Zero was firing on our position. Most significantly, the report described moment of impact. According to the document, at 13:47 hours, approximately 4 minutes into combat engagement, we felt impact in nose section. No explosion, but immediate vibration and loss of control response. I observed red fluid spraying across windscreen. Initially suspected fuel leak, but quickly identified fluid as hydraulic based on color and spray pattern. Checked hydraulic pressure gauge, reading 0. All hydraulic systems showed failure. Flaps, inoperative. Landing gear, inoperative. Nose wheel steering, inoperative. Brakes, inoperative. 13:47, 13:52 hours. Larner's testimony, recorded during post-mission debriefing March 5, 1943, described 5-minute period between hydraulic failure and decision to attempt unconventional landing rather than following standard bailout procedure. According to the testimony, Larner immediately assessed damage and options. The testimony stated, first priority was determining extent of system failure. I tested flap controls, no response. Attempted to lower landing gear using normal hydraulic system, no response. Attempted emergency gear extension using backup system, also hydraulic, no response. Tested nose wheel steering, no response. Tested brakes, no response. Complete hydraulic failure across all systems. At this point, standard operating procedure is clear. Catastrophic hydraulic failure at altitude over water requires crew to bail out and abandon aircraft. The testimony documented that Larner surveyed situation below before committing to bailout. According to the account, from 18,000 feet I could see entire battle area. Bismarck Sea engagement was at maximum intensity. Ocean surface covered with Japanese ships both intact and damaged. Numerous lifeboats visible indicating Japanese vessels had already been sunk. Swimmers in water. Debris field extensive. If crew bailed out at this location, we would descend directly into combat zone controlled by Japanese forces fighting for survival. Probability of rescue by Allied forces before Japanese capture was near zero. Probability of Japanese taking prisoners versus killing downed airmen in midst of battle was unknown, but not favorable. Most significantly, the testimony revealed Larner's calculation process. According to the account, I had three options. Option 1, follow procedure, order bailout, crew parachutes into enemy-controlled waters, probable capture or death, but my responsibility ends because I followed regulations. Option 2, attempt conventional landing at Port Moresby without hydraulics, guaranteed crash on touchdown due to inability to control aircraft during rollout, guaranteed fatalities, but at least we tried to get home. Option 3, attempt unconventional landing using controlled high-speed impact to skip aircraft along runway, dissipating energy through friction and bounce sequence. Option 3 had never been done in combat. It existed only in theory from engineering discussions about emergency procedures, but it gave us chance when other options gave us none. I chose option 3. I informed crew of decision. I told them, we're going to try something that's never been done. Strap in tight. If this works, we'll walk away. If it doesn't work, we'll die quickly, but we won't die in enemy hands and we won't die in ocean. We'll die trying to get home. 1352 to 1400 hours. Navigator Chen's testimony recorded March 6, 1943, described crew's response to Larner's announcement and the flight back to Port Moresby with damaged aircraft. According to Chen's testimony, crew reaction was mixed, but ultimately trusting. The testimony stated, when Larner announced we were not bailing out, and instead were attempting experimental landing procedure, initial response was shock. Bombardier Torres asked if he'd lost his mind. Radio operator Walsh asked what our chances were. Larner said honestly, I don't know, but they're better than bailout over enemy waters. He explained the physics, high-speed impact, controlled bounce, friction dissipation. It sounded insane. But when we looked out windows and saw Japanese ships below, we understood. Bailout meant capture. Landing attempt meant chance. We chose chance. The testimony documented preparations crew made during 18-minute flight to Port Moresby. According to the account, Larner ordered everyone to crash positions. We moved to positions that would provide maximum protection during impact. I moved from navigation station forward to position braced against bulkhead. Torres moved from bombardier nose position to radio compartment, where structural supports were strongest. Henderson and Morrison secured waist gun positions. Walsh transmitted distress signal to Port Moresby Tower, explaining situation and requesting emergency equipment. Tower responded, asking if we were bailing out. Walsh said negative. We're attempting emergency landing. Tower asked what type of landing. Walsh said unconventional. Tower said clarify. Walsh said pilot will explain after we're down. Most significantly, Chen's testimony described Larner's behavior during approach. According to the account, Larner was completely calm. He explained each step as we approached. He said, I'm going to maintain 180 miles per hour, much faster than normal approach speed. I'm not going to try to land. I'm going to fly aircraft into runway at shallow angle. We're going to bounce multiple times. Each bounce will slow us down. Friction will slow us down. Eventually, we'll stop. When we hit, don't tense up, stay loose. Tensing causes injuries. Just hold on. His calm was contagious. If he believed this would work, we believed it. Looking back, I realize he might have been faking the calm. He might have been terrified, but he projected absolute confidence. That confidence saved us because we trusted him completely. 14:04 to 14:07 hours. Ground crew member Technical Sergeant William Brooks, who recorded landing with 16mm camera, provided written testimony March 5, 1943, describing what observers saw from runway. According to Brooks' testimony, Tower had cleared all aircraft from pattern and positioned emergency equipment. The testimony stated, Tower called general alert at 14:02 hours, B-25 with hydraulic failure inbound for emergency landing, all aircraft diverted, fire trucks positioned at runway end.
Ambulances standing by, medical personnel on alert. We expected either belly landing or crash. Pilot had not specified landing technique. Tower asked multiple times for clarification. Pilot responded, "Just watch." At 14:04 hours, we saw aircraft on approach. Immediately obvious something was wrong. Aircraft was coming in much too fast, estimated 180 miles per hour versus normal 110. Aircraft was level rather than nose-up landing attitude. Pilot wasn't attempting to land, he was attempting to maintain altitude until last possible second. The testimony documented impact sequence according to archives. Brooks stated, at 14:05 hours aircraft crossed threshold still at high speed. Nose wheel was up, obviously because hydraulics were failed. Main gear was up. Pilot was going to belly land at 180 miles per hour.
We braced for explosion. Aircraft descended rapidly in last 200 feet. Then pilot did something I'd never seen. He pulled nose up sharply, creating high angle of attack. Aircraft hit runway tail first. Tail struck pavement with tremendous impact, creating shower of sparks. Aircraft bounced. Not small bounce, but full airborne bounce, reaching estimated 20 feet altitude. Aircraft came down again. This time, belly struck runway. Another shower of sparks. Another bounce, shorter this time, maybe 15 feet. Pattern repeated. Bounce, impact, bounce, impact. Each bounce shorter than previous. Each impact lasting longer. With each impact, aircraft slowed measurably. After approximately 6 or 7 bounces, aircraft stayed on ground, sliding on belly. Friction created enormous dust and spark cloud.
Aircraft finally stopped approximately 2,000 feet down runway. Total landing roll approximately 3,500 feet, longer than normal but remarkably short given initial speed. Most significantly, Brooks described crew egress. According to the account, fire trucks reached aircraft within 30 seconds, crews prepared for fire suppression. Hatch opened, crew began evacuating. First man out, I later learned was navigator Chen, jumped to ground, stumbled, then stood up. He was laughing. Other crew members followed, all walking, no visible injuries. Last man out was pilot, Captain Larner. He climbed down, surveyed damage to aircraft, then walked calmly toward debriefing area. Medical personnel rushed forward. Larner waved them off, saying crew was fine. His exact words were, "We're okay, check the aircraft.
If it's salvageable, I'll fly it again tomorrow." Aircraft was not salvageable. March 5, 1943. Squadron Commander Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Harrison's confidential memorandum, dated March 5, 1943, preserved at Air Force Historical Research Agency, assessed Larner's decision and recommended simultaneous commendation and psychiatric evaluation. The memorandum stated that Harrison had debriefed Larner and crew immediately following landing. According to the memorandum, Captain Larner's landing of damaged B-25 on March 4, 1943, represents either extraordinary airmanship under catastrophic failure conditions or dangerous disregard for standard operating procedures depending on perspective.
Facts are these. Larner experienced complete hydraulic failure at 18,000 feet over enemy-controlled waters. Standard procedure requires crew to bail out and abandon aircraft. Larner chose instead to attempt landing using experimental technique, high-speed controlled impact with intentional bouncing to dissipate kinetic energy. Landing succeeded. All crew survived without serious injury. Aircraft was damaged beyond repair, but crew survived. Question for evaluation: did Larner make sound tactical decision based on combat circumstances, or did he unnecessarily risk crew lives to avoid following standard procedure? The memorandum documented Harrison's analysis according to archives. The memorandum stated arguments supporting Larner's decision. First, bailout over enemy-controlled waters during active combat would likely have resulted in crew capture or death. Japanese forces in Bismarck Sea were fighting for survival and unlikely to take prisoners. Second, Larner possessed unique combination of engineering knowledge and flying skill, making him capable of attempting experimental procedure that average pilot could not execute. Third, outcome justifies decision. All crew survived. Arguments questioning Larner's decision. First, standard procedure exists for reason. Bailout over water has high survival rate if rescue forces are nearby. Second, attempting untested landing procedure with 5 crew members aboard without their explicit informed consent raises command authority questions. Third, success doesn't validate risk. If landing had failed, killing entire crew, decision would be indefensible. Fourth, Larner's willingness to ignore procedures might encourage other pilots to attempt dangerous maneuvers without necessary skill or judgment. Most significantly, the memorandum made dual recommendation. According to the document, I am recommending Captain Larner for Distinguished Flying Cross based on successful emergency landing under catastrophic failure conditions, saving 5 crew members. Simultaneously, I am recommending psychiatric evaluation to determine if Larner's decision-making process represents sound judgment or reckless disregard for established procedures. Psychiatric evaluation should assess whether Larner is fit to continue flying combat missions or whether his demonstrated willingness to deviate from standard procedures makes him liability. This dual recommendation reflects inherent contradiction. We want pilots who can improvise under impossible conditions, but we also want pilots who follow procedures designed to keep them alive. Larner succeeded by ignoring procedures. This success is both his greatest achievement and greatest problem from institutional perspective. March 8, 1943. Military psychiatrist Captain David Foster's psychiatric evaluation, dated March 8, 1943, preserved at National Archives, assessed Larner's mental state and decision-making capacity. The evaluation stated that Foster interviewed Larner for approximately 90 minutes. According to the evaluation, Captain Larner presents as calm, rational, articulate individual with clear understanding of risk and consequences. When asked why he chose experimental landing procedure over standard bailout procedure, he responded, "Bailout meant probable death. Landing attempt meant possible survival. I chose possible survival over probable death. Mathematics were clear." When pressed about risking crew lives, he responded, "I didn't risk their lives. Bailout would have risked their lives. I gave them chance when procedure gave them none." When asked if he would make same decision again, he responded without hesitation, "Yes, every time. Under same circumstances, I would do exactly same thing." The evaluation documented Foster's assessment of Larner's psychological profile according to archives. The evaluation stated, Captain Larner demonstrates several traits concerning from regulatory compliance perspective, but valuable from combat effectiveness perspective. First, he possesses strong internal locus of control. He believes outcomes depend on his actions rather than external factors. This makes him confident decision-maker, but potentially resistant to authority. Second, he demonstrates high risk tolerance when risk appears calculated rather than random. He distinguishes between necessary risk and unnecessary risk based on his assessment of alternatives. Third, he shows strong sense of personal responsibility for crew welfare. He views his role as commander as requiring him to maximize crew survival probability, even if this requires deviating from procedures. Fourth, he exhibits what might be termed practical creativity, ability to solve novel problems using unconventional application of physics and engineering principles. Most significantly, the evaluation made recommendation regarding fitness for duty. According to the document, Captain Larner is fit to continue flying combat missions. His decision to attempt experimental landing was not result of impaired judgment or disregard for crew safety. Rather, it was calculated assessment that procedures designed for normal failure conditions did not apply to catastrophic failure combined with combat circumstances. However, recommend that Larner be reassigned to different crew to prevent formation of team dynamic where deviation from procedure becomes normalized. Additionally, recommend that Larner's landing technique be documented for engineering analysis, but explicitly not be included in pilot training as standard procedure. Technique succeeded because of Larner's unique combination of skill, knowledge, and desperation. Average pilots attempting same maneuver would likely fail with catastrophic results. March 1943, August 1945. Meanwhile, over 30 months between Larner's March 1943 landing and end of war in August 1945, his technique was studied by engineering teams assessing emergency procedures for aircraft with catastrophic system failures. Larner's landing analysis report, dated July 1943, preserved at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base archives, assessed physics and structural implications of controlled high-speed impact landing. The report stated that engineers examined Hell's Bells wreckage to understand how aircraft had survived bouncing landing. According to the report, post-impact examination of B-25 tail number 41, TONT 463, reveals significant structural deformation consistent with multiple high-energy impacts. Fuselage shows compression of approximately 7 inches measured from nose to tail. This compression indicates that aircraft structure absorbed kinetic energy through controlled deformation rather than catastrophic failure. Tail section shows impact damage consistent with initial tail strike at estimated 180 miles per hour. Belly skin shows abrasion and deformation consistent with multiple belly slides along concrete runway. Wing roots show stress fractures indicating loads exceeded design limits but remained below catastrophic failure threshold. The report analyzed why aircraft didn't explode on impact according to archives. The report stated, critical factor in successful outcome was angle of impact. Captain Larner achieved tail strike first with nose elevated, creating high angle of attack. This prevented nose section from striking runway with full force, which would have caused nose gear bay to collapse upward into cockpit, killing pilot and navigator. By striking tail first, Larner directed initial impact energy into strongest part of aircraft structure, tail boom and empennage, designed to withstand high loads. Subsequent belly impacts distributed remaining energy across entire lower fuselage rather than concentrating force in single location.
Result was structural deformation across large area rather than catastrophic failure in single component. Most significantly, the report assessed applicability of technique for emergency procedures. According to the document, Captain Larner's landing technique is physically sound and successfully demonstrated under combat conditions. However, technique requires several factors that cannot be guaranteed in emergency situations. First, pilot must possess exceptional flying skill to maintain precise control at high speed during complex impact sequence. Second, aircraft must have sufficient structural integrity to survive multiple high-energy impacts without catastrophic failure. Third, runway must be long enough to accommodate extended landing roll. Hell's Bells required approximately 3,500 feet to stop versus normal 1,500 feet. Fourth,
Impact sequence must be executed precisely. Any deviation from optimal angle or timing could result in cartwheel or fireball. Conclusion: technique is viable last resort option for aircraft with complete hydraulic failure when bailout is not option. However, technique should not be included in standard training curriculum because risk of unsuccessful execution outweighs benefit of additional emergency option for average pilots. 1947 to 1950. Published aviation safety literature from late 1940s documented ongoing debate about whether Larner's landing represented commendable innovation or dangerous precedent.
Article titled Emergency Landing Procedures, Innovation versus Procedure, published in Air Force Safety Journal 1948, examined Larner's case. The article stated that aviation safety community was divided about implications. According to the article, Captain Edward Larner's March 1943 emergency landing raises fundamental question about relationship between procedure and innovation in aviation safety. Procedures exist because they represent collective wisdom developed through decades of experience and analysis. When pilot deviates from procedure, he substitutes his individual judgment for institutional knowledge. But procedures assume normal range of failure conditions. What happens when failure is catastrophic and procedure no longer applies?
Larner faced exactly this situation. Hydraulic failure making conventional landing impossible, combined with combat circumstances making bailout equivalent to death sentence. He chose innovation over procedure. He succeeded. Does his success validate his decision, or does it create dangerous precedent encouraging other pilots to improvise in situations where procedure would be safer? The article documented arguments from both sides according to published account. The article stated, proponents argue that Larner's landing demonstrates value of pilot judgment and creativity. They point out that procedures cannot anticipate every possible scenario. When unprecedented situation arises, pilot must improvise. Larner's willingness to attempt untested techniques saved 5 lives that procedure would have sacrificed.
Critics counter that procedures exist precisely because improvisation often fails catastrophically. They argue that Larner was lucky, that same maneuver attempted by different pilot or with slightly different conditions would have resulted in fireball killing entire crew. They worry that celebrating Larner's success will encourage pilots to deviate from procedures prematurely rather than exhausting all conventional options first. Most significantly, the article proposed framework for evaluating similar decisions. According to published account, appropriate standards should consider 3 factors. First, have all conventional options been exhausted? Larner had complete hydraulic failure. Conventional landing was physically impossible, not merely difficult. Second, does alternative approach have sound theoretical basis? Larner's bouncing technique was grounded in physics and engineering, even if untested in practice. Third, is pilot qualified to execute alternative approach? Larner had engineering knowledge and flying skill, making him unusually qualified. Using this framework, Larner's decision was justified. But framework also establishes high bar. Deviation from procedure requires complete failure of conventional options, sound theoretical alternative, and exceptional pilot capability. Most emergency situations do not meet all 3 criteria. 1956. Training film titled Unconventional Recovery from Catastrophic Hydraulic Failure, produced 1956, preserved at Air Force Historical Research Agency Film Archives, used footage of Larner's landing for pilot education. The film opened with disclaimer according to archived copy. Opening text stated, "The following footage documents emergency landing performed by Captain Edward Larner on March 4, 1943. Technique shown is not recommended under normal circumstances. Technique is shown for educational purposes, illustrating physics of emergency landing when all conventional options have been exhausted. Do not attempt technique shown unless
1. All hydraulic systems have completely failed, making conventional landing impossible. 2. Bailout is not a viable option due to combat or weather conditions. 3. Runway length exceeds 4,000 feet. 4. You possess demonstrated exceptional flying skill. If above conditions are not met, follow standard emergency procedures. The film narration explained what viewers were seeing according to archived transcript. Narrator stated, "What you are about to see is 16mm footage recorded by ground crew at Port Moresby, Papua New Guinea on March 4, 1943. B-25. Mitchell bomber approaching for landing has suffered complete hydraulic failure. Pilot has chosen to attempt high-speed intentional ground collision to dissipate kinetic energy through series of controlled bounces. Watch carefully how pilot maintains 180 miles per hour approach speed, significantly faster than normal 110 miles per hour. Note how pilot keeps aircraft level until final approach, preventing premature touchdown. Watch tail strike. Pilot has elevated nose, creating high angle of attack, ensuring tail absorbs initial impact rather than nose. Note bounce pattern. Each bounce shorter than previous as kinetic energy is dissipated. Count impacts. You will see approximately 7 distinct bounces before aircraft remains on ground. Final belly slide creates massive spark and dust cloud as friction dissipates remaining energy. Total landing roll approximately 3,500 feet. All crew survived without serious injury. Most significantly, the film concluded with explicit warning, according to archived version. Final text stated, "Technique shown succeeded because pilot possessed unique combination of circumstances. Complete hydraulic failure, making conventional landing physically impossible. Combat situation making bailout likely fatal. Exceptional flying skill enabling precise execution of experimental maneuver." Average pilots attempting this technique without these specific circumstances will likely fail with catastrophic results. Remember, procedures exist because they save lives. Deviate from procedures only when procedures no longer apply and when you possess skill and knowledge to execute alternative approach successfully. Captain Larner succeeded because he correctly assessed that standard procedure would kill his crew and that he possessed skill to attempt alternative. Can you make same assessment? Are you certain? 1985. Crew reunion held March 4th.
1985, 42 years after landing, brought together 5 surviving crew members to commemorate emergency landing and assess its significance with benefit of decades of perspective. Navigator Chen's remarks at reunion, preserved in private collection, reflected on Larner's decision. According to Chen's statement, for 42 years, people have asked if we thought Larner was crazy for attempting that landing. Answer is complicated. In moment, yes, we thought he might be insane, who intentionally crashes airplane at 180 miles per hour. But we also understood his logic. Bailout meant capture or death. Landing attempt meant chance. Looking back with 4 decades of perspective, I'm certain he made right decision, not because it worked, though obviously we're grateful it worked, but because his reasoning was sound. He didn't gamble recklessly. He calculated precisely. He assessed alternatives. He chose option that gave us best probability of survival. That's not insanity, that's command. Bombardier Torres's statement at reunion addressed question of consent. According to Torres's remarks, people ask if Larner should have asked our permission before attempting experimental landing. My answer, there was no time for debate. We had 18 minutes from hydraulic failure to touchdown. Larner made command decision. That's what commanders do. Did we trust him? Absolutely. Could any of us have executed that landing? Absolutely not. Only Larner had combination of engineering knowledge and flying skill to attempt that technique. He didn't ask permission because there was no alternative to evaluate. He told us what he was going to do. We strapped in. We trusted him.
He saved us. Most significantly, Larner's own statement at reunion addressed accusation that his landing represented dangerous precedent. According to Larner's remarks, "I've heard for 40 years that my landing encouraged pilots to deviate from procedures. That's nonsense. I didn't deviate from procedures by choice. I deviated because procedures didn't apply. Procedure said land conventionally, but I had no hydraulics. Conventional landing was physically impossible. Procedure said bail out, but we were over enemy waters during combat. Bailout meant probable death. So I chose third option that wasn't in procedures because procedures hadn't anticipated catastrophic hydraulic failure combined with combat circumstances. I've been called mad pilot. Fine, call me mad. But I'd rather be mad pilot with living crew than sane pilot with dead crew. You tell me which is more insane, following procedure that kills everyone or attempting technique that saves everyone. Mathematics are clear." Analysis comparing outcomes of hydraulic failure incidents during World War II Pacific Theater revealed significant differences between pilots who followed standard bailout procedures versus those who attempted alternative landing approaches. Statistical review documented in various military studies showed that of 37 documented complete hydraulic failure incidents in B-25 bombers during Pacific Campaign, 29 crews followed standard bailout procedure. Of those 29 crews, estimated 73% of personnel bailed out successfully. However, when bailout occurred over enemy-controlled waters during active combat, recovery rate dropped to approximately 41%. Remaining 59% were either captured by enemy forces, killed during capture attempts, or lost at sea before rescue could arrive. 8 crews attempted alternative approaches to catastrophic hydraulic failure, including Larner's crew. Of those 8 attempts, 4 resulted in successful landings with crew survival. 3 resulted in aircraft destruction on impact, with total crew fatalities. 1 resulted in successful ditching at sea, followed by rescue. Success rate was 50% compared to 73% for standard bailout procedure under normal conditions, but compared favorably to 41% for bailout over enemy waters during combat. This contrast demonstrated that standard procedures optimized for average conditions don't necessarily optimize for worst-case scenarios. Bailout procedure maximized survival probability, assuming rescue forces could reach crew before enemy forces. But during active combat in enemy-controlled waters, that assumption failed. Larner's assessment that attempted landing, even experimental landing with 50% historical success rate, was superior to bailout procedure with 41% success rate under combat conditions, was mathematically correct.
The Camp Como approach, validated by these metrics, influenced American cultural diplomacy strategy throughout Cold War. State Department recognized that demonstrating cultural continuity between America and Europe was more effective than emphasizing American exceptionalism for winning European support during occupation and alliance building. Captain Edward Larner's March 1943 emergency landing revealed fundamental truths about relationship between procedure and innovation, mathematics of risk assessment under catastrophic failure conditions, and distinction between recklessness and calculated risk-taking.
First truth: procedures optimize for normal range of failure conditions, but catastrophic failures require unconventional solutions because procedures assume systems will retain some functionality. Larner faced complete hydraulic failure, not degraded hydraulics requiring careful landing, but zero hydraulics making conventional landing physically impossible. Standard procedure assumed bailout was a viable option, but standard procedure didn't account for bailout over enemy-controlled waters during active combat, where capture or death probability exceeded landing attempt failure probability. When procedures no longer apply because underlying assumptions have failed, pilot must substitute individual judgment for institutional wisdom. This substitution is not deviation from procedure, but recognition that procedure has reached its limits. Second truth, risk assessment must account for both probability and consequences of available options rather than simply choosing option that appears safest under normal conditions. Bailout procedure had higher success rate than experimental landing under normal conditions, 73% versus approximately 50%. But normal conditions didn't apply. Combat conditions reduced bailout success to approximately 41%, while landing attempt maintained 50% probability. Larner correctly calculated that attempting landing with 50% success probability was superior to bailout with 41% probability, even though bailout was standard procedure. Mathematics of survival sometimes require choosing unconventional option with better odds than conventional option with worse odds. Third truth, successful deviation from procedure requires three elements: exhaustion of conventional options, sound theoretical basis for alternative approach, and exceptional capability to execute alternative. Larner met all three criteria. Conventional landing was physically impossible, making conventional options truly exhausted. Bouncing landing technique had sound basis in physics and engineering, and Larner possessed unusual combination of engineering knowledge and flying skill enabling execution. When all three elements are present, deviation from procedure represents sound judgment rather than recklessness. When any element is missing, deviation becomes gamble rather than calculated risk. Fourth truth, innovation and procedure exist in tension because procedures codify past successful solutions, while innovation requires attempting untested approaches when past solutions no longer work. Larner's landing succeeded through innovation, but his success created institutional problem. Celebrating innovation potentially encourages premature deviation from procedures that work in majority of situations. Military attempted to resolve this tension by commending Larner while warning others not to attempt similar maneuvers. This contradictory message, praising success while discouraging replication, reflects inherent difficulty of managing relationship between procedure and innovation. Organizations need both procedural discipline and innovative problem solving, but emphasizing either extreme creates problems. Fifth truth, physical artifacts documenting successful unconventional solutions become teaching tools demonstrating that procedures aren't absolute, but rather represent best practices for normal conditions that must be reconsidered when conditions become abnormal. Footage of Larner's landing, compressed fuselage showing energy absorption, and engineering analysis of impact physics all served as evidence that bouncing landing technique was viable last resort option. These artifacts didn't encourage reckless deviation from procedures. Rather, they demonstrated that when all conventional options fail and when pilot possesses necessary skill, physics allows alternatives that regulations don't explicitly authorize. Teaching that such alternatives exist without recommending them as standard practice maintains appropriate balance between procedural discipline and innovative problem solving. Captain Edward Larner's journey from pilot-facing catastrophic hydraulic failure to mad pilot who saved his crew through experimental landing technique represented transformation that challenged institutional assumptions about procedure versus innovation. What began as hydraulic failure that standard procedure said required bailout evolved through rapid calculation into determination that combat circumstances made procedures' assumptions invalid. What resulted was successful landing using technique that existed only in engineering theory, saving 5 lives that procedure would likely have sacrificed. The bouncing landing at Port Moresby wasn't merely emergency procedure, but demonstration that when systems fail catastrophically and when procedures optimize for conditions that no longer exist, physics and flying skill enable alternatives that regulations don't anticipate. Every bounce that dissipated kinetic energy, every tail strike that absorbed impact force, Every belly slide that created friction was evidence that aircraft could be treated as demolition tool rather than delicate machine, when crew survival required sacrificing machine to save men. 42 years later, when surviving crew members gathered to commemorate landing, the transformation from terrified passengers trusting mad pilot to grateful witnesses defending his judgment was complete. They understood what critics who questioned Larner's sanity didn't, that refusing to follow procedure that would kill them wasn't insanity, but sanest choice available when procedure's assumptions had failed. The mathematics of that transformation were written in velocity calculations showing 180 mph approach was necessary to achieve bouncing rather than crashing, angle of attack equations proving tail strike first absorbed maximum impact force, and structural analysis demonstrating 7-inch fuselage compression dissipated kinetic energy that would otherwise have caused fireball. And those mathematics proved that sometimes what appears mad from outside, intentionally crashing airplane at high speed, represents precisely calculated solution from inside when all sane conventional options lead to death. What military called calculated insanity was really recognition that sanity means choosing physics over procedure when procedure no longer applies. That turning dying bomber into controlled bomb wasn't recklessness, but last available option when hydraulics failed, when enemy waters waited below, when standard procedure offered 41% survival probability and experimental technique offered 50%. That saving crew by destroying aircraft wasn't failure of judgment, but success of unconventional application of engineering principles under catastrophic conditions. By the time Hell's Bells slid to stop in massive cloud of sparks and dust, and ground crew rushed forward expecting to find bodies, but instead found crew walking away, laughing with relief. The question of whether Larner was mad or brilliant had been answered conclusively. He was both. Mad enough to attempt landing that regulations said was suicide, brilliant enough to execute it successfully through precise application of physics that most pilots didn't understand. And that combination, madness to attempt impossible combined with brilliance to achieve it, proved that sometimes the sanest thing a pilot can do is what everyone else thinks is insane.